I am the outreach coordinator for the Black Alliance for Peace, which we call BAP. And it's a people-centered human rights project against war, repression, and imperialism. BAP is a Black anti-war formation created to cultivate the important Black radical analysis and organizing methods into the anti-war movement of today. So anyone can learn more about BAP, about BAP campaigns, BAP supports, and even join BAP as a member or a supporter at Black Alliance for Peace. And you can also donate there. So the title of our program is Venezuela, Humanitarian Intervention or Imperialism. The U.S. has announced that they recognize as president of Venezuela a man who no one even had an opportunity to elect. And they're claiming to do this in the name of democracy. It's really interesting because you would think that it's an easy democratic approach would be to just recognize the right of that sovereign nation to decide on its, but that's not the democratic approach that the U.S. is taking. Instead, the U.S. is asserting a right that it does not have to decide who the president of the country is. And also, the U.S. is promising to help the people of Venezuela democratically be relieved of their wealth of resources. So they help the economic struggles of the people of Venezuela by putting their wealth into the hands of private U.S. This plan was made plain by the U.S. National Security Advisor, John Bolton, when he said, it will make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela. So the U.S. has already instituted some of this help by imposing sanctions, discouraging the purchase of oil from Venezuela, except for oil that was sourced by U.S. companies like Chevron and Halliburton. But we have to be clear, whether the interest in Venezuela is its oil or actual humanitarian concerns, the idea that the U.S. has the right to determine the future of Venezuela or impose their vision in that nation is white supremacist, imperialist, and neocolonialist at its core. So on February 23rd, people all around the world are gathering in forums to show solidarity with, again, the sovereign nation people. Of people who have genuine humanitarian concerns are confused about what solidarity with the Venezuelan people actually looks like. So that's why I've invited experienced and well-informed individuals to come and unpack the situation right now and help some people to expand their understanding about what's going on without the influence of lobbyists, elite dollars, and political aims. So I would like to introduce the individuals who I've invited that are here with us now. First, I will introduce Abby Martin, who is co-host of Media Roots Radio and creator of the Empire Files. Hi, Abby.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on. It's a true honor.
I'm glad that you're here. And also, I'm joined by the national organizer of the Black Alliance, the Green Party's 2016 vice presidential candidate, Ajamu Baraka. I want to say hi to, Ajamu is not being arriving shortly. So, let's just start off by just talking about the experiences that you've had, Abby, on the ground in Venezuela. You have, so the U.S. has imposed sanctions, aids, has manipulated oil prices, and has been working to rise the country of Venezuela for quite some time now, and over a period of the sanctions being imposed in, I think, 2017, the most recent sanctions. So what have you seen in being on Venezuela? What's the reaction been of the ordinary Venezuelan people to the idea that what these things, these sanctions, these blockades, that these things are actually for their own good?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for having me, Yane, and really great question. Because if you're looking at the US mainstream media, all you really see is that there's a humanitarian crisis, quote unquote, and it's caused by the Maduro regime, right? And you don't really even hear this side of what are sanctions doing to impede and asphyxiate the economy of Venezuela. And, let's go back to 2013. This was before any sanctions were implemented during the Obama administration. And there was an economic blockade that was installed by Obama that started to siphon Venezuela's economy back then. Alfred de Zayas is a UN human rights investigator, a rapporteur. He was the first human rights investigator to go to Venezuela in 21 years. And when he went there, he was shocked to find that, he said there is no humanitarian crisis. There's an economic crisis that could turn into a humanitarian crisis because of what the US financial blockade is doing to suffocate the country. From 2013 to 2015, they already lost hundreds of millions of dollars from the first economic blockade before sanctions were even implemented. Now, Obama in 2015 implemented about 6 or 7 sanctions that started to restrict Venezuela even more, but really Trump getting in there and completely just, completely abolishing any sort of sense for Venezuela to have any sort of economic recovery. Because as we know, we're talking about an economy that's 95% dependent on oil exports. That is what their economy is dependent on. We're talking about centuries of colonialism. People will, kind of pontificate in America, sitting in their ivory towers about what Maduro should have done and what he should have done to diversify the economy. Look, he had a choice: either implement widespread social programs, use the oil revenue to care for the poor, and uplift tens of millions of Venezuelans that were invisibilized, that were rendered invisible by previous administrations that were aligned with the US government. And so these sanctions had an enormous impact. Just one sanction alone had blocked 300,000 doses of insulin shipments. Genocidal impacts that these sanctions had. Dialysis treatments have been blockaded, hundreds of millions of dollars in food and medicine treatments. So, what Alfred de Zayas, this UN human rights expert, has said is that the sanctions are what is causing the actual humanitarian crisis. But to your point, Yane, when I was there on the ground, I was kind of surprised, first of all, how starkly contrasted the reality is on the ground to what we see in the corporate media. People are living their lives, they're going about their daily lives, going to work, buying food at the grocery store. There's not mass starvation, there's not mass famine. There are a certain shortage of certain items that make it very hard for people to, make basic things and meet basic necessities. And so those have been exacerbated by the economic war and within the country's elite, the bourgeois opposition that's aligned with Trump and with the ultra-right. And they are exacerbating that economic war. So the people in Venezuela told me, look, it's a class struggle, and it's also a very dichotomous kind of reply that you get. It's either we're living in a dictatorship, we're starving, when they see that you're an American and they're speaking to an American audience. And a lot of upper class white Venezuelans, with very expensive clothes and jewelry told me this. And then you kind of go to the barrios and the poor areas and the people say, the media is distorting what's going on. There is an economic war and Maduro is carrying on the Bolivarian revolution. And so there's two very starkly contrasted narratives that are at play here. And it's very obvious on the ground why that is.
Thanks. Yeah, and so just what you're describing is that the people who, while we're claiming that we're fighting for the poor and the dispossessed, that the people that we would actually be fighting for if we went into supporting this coup would be the wealthy, the elites, the oligarchical class. Is that?
You're absolutely right. You can see the color of the sea of protesters versus the pro-government marches. It's black and white. I mean, it really is a class war, and that's why we're kind of on the verge of what could become a civil war based on a class war, a class struggle here. Again, the poor Afro-Indigenous Venezuelans support the government, and so they're being cynically used and exploited by the U.S. empire as a stunt, frankly. We're constricting access to food and medicine to the poorest people and then using them as a ploy to somehow pretense a humanitarian intervention with our military. I mean, it's really the most disgusting thing in the world.
We have been joined by Ajamu Baraka, who again, is the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace and the Green Party's 2016 vice presidential candidate. Ajama, did you have something you wanted to add to that discussion?
Well, I think I wanted to just sort of jump in and echo what Abby is communicating regarding this whole concept of humanitarian intervention. You know, what we wanted to talk about this evening, or the first aspect of it, was we raised the question, humanitarian interventionism or imperialism.
Right.
And that's a very important construction, because what we have observed over the last almost 2 decades is what we have seen, or what we call as the attempt to weaponize the concept of humanitarianism, providing a political cover for intervention, for imperialist aggression, under the notion that you are there to save the people. You are engaged in a humanitarian mission. So before we get into the specifics of what is really unfolding in Venezuela, let's talk about that for a moment. And look at the genesis of it and how it's been used politically, because it's very important that we do that, because, you know, the humanitarian idea is an idea in which the state and these oppressive forces attempt to try to appeal to the best instincts of the people. They suggest that people have some kind of moral responsibility to go in and to save the people from these murderous dictators or some human rights crisis. And that has been a very powerful weapon, because it has resonated with the people. But what we have seen is that beneath the surface of that humanitarian concept has been a naked imperialist agenda, and an agenda and an idea that is the ultimate expression, if you will, of a white supremacist colonialist mentality, because they have used the notion of humanitarianism to assume for themselves the right and the responsibility to be able to intervene into the internal affairs of various nations, to determine the leadership of nations, to actually determine who lives and who dies. You know, we might recall that one of the justifications for the murderous sanctions imposed on Iraq was that it was to liberate the Iraqi people from Saddam Hussein. And I know Abby and many people who are watching this show remember that famous interview with Madeleine Albright, when the question was posed, with 500,000 people dying as a consequence of sanctions, with many of them being children, what's your response? Was it worth it? And basically, she said in so many words that that 500,000 people, real live human beings who died as a consequence of U.S. sanctions, that it was in fact was worth the cost. Now, no one consulted those people to ask them if they were prepared to surrender their lives for some broader noble cause. Nobody asked the parents of those kids that died if they were prepared to sacrifice their kids' life for the U.S. agenda. The U.S. Assumed for itself the right to be able to determine that people will lose their lives for a bigger cause that they have in fact defined. So this humanitarian interventionist idea is one of the most egregious and nefarious concepts ever created. It was a gift given to the state by the human rights community, and has been used as a instrument to advance the agenda of what we call the axis of domination, the U.S., EU, and NATO axis of domination. And it's something we've got to bring attention to and completely delegitimize, especially the concept of white saviorism.
Thank you. And you know, and that reminds me what I mentioned earlier, you know, what happened in Libya. And this idea that we are going in, because there's also the reality of the aftermath, We go into these countries supposedly to save their lives, to save the lives of the people, to improve the lives of the people. And then afterwards, when things are left in shambles and people people are displaced, if they've survived, we've turned our back. We've moved on to something else and left the country in a worse condition than it was in before we swooped in with our so-called capes, or I should say the U.S. swooped in with those capes in order to try to save and rescue the people from whatever issue it is that they decided to make up is the case. And I'm wondering, when we look at our political establishment, and particularly the Black political establishment, right now, they are seeming to give legitimacy to this narrative and supporting Trump's claim that this is about concern for the plight of the people of Venezuela. And they're supporting this, using this notion of humanitarian intervention. Why do you think that is happening with the, particularly with the members of the Black political establishment?
I think that that's a reflection of the pervasiveness of white supremacist ideology, that it is inculcated by all elements of society. So what should be seen as an obvious white supremacist move by the daddy Trump determining who would be the leader of Venezuela, some way that's not being perceived as the arrogant white supremacist decision that it is. So it reflects the kind of shift that's taking place in the overall consciousness of the general public, and specifically in the Black public also, as a consequence of the normalization of imperialism, as a consequence of Barack Obama's influence ideologically. We've seen a real decided shift to the right, even among some sectors of the Black population. So part of what we are trying to do with the Black Alliance for Peace is to try to reverse that. We believe that it's absolute necessity for Black people and other people of conscience to understand that we have a responsibility to attempt to put a break on these kinds of interventions, that our strategic location within the center of empire provides us a political but also a moral responsibility to oppose these kinds of murderous interventions. So, but it's easier said than done. We have a lot of work to do, as long as information is being monopolized by the corporate media, and they're able to construct these narratives that Abby was talking about earlier. It's very difficult for us to, in fact, make those reversals in consciousness we have to make, not only for ourselves, but really for the collective humanity of the planet.
Yeah, and speaking of this media, this way that the media has been portraying this, Abby, how do you explain the distorted media coverage of the situation within the mainstream corporate media?
Sure, it might be hard for some people to wrap their minds around that, the uniformity and this kind of lockstep uniformity of the corporate media working on behalf of the U.S. empire. They bemoan state organs as propaganda organs, frankly, like Telesur, Russia Today. But frankly, the corporate media completely echoes the line of the Pentagon far, far more than these organizations do. So why is that? Why is that? Well, you can look at the subsidization of the corporate media from defense contractors, from big oil, kind of a constant reminder of who your advertisers and owners are. But I think it would be remiss if we thought that corporate news anchors and journalists were hired and told to lie. I think a lot of these corporate news entities hand-pick people who fit into the right thinking perspective, who fit into that ideological framework where they believe in the myths that underpin American empire. And they believe in American exceptionalism. And they believe that the U.S. is this benign force that does things with good intentions around the world. They actually think that they stand in opposition to these quote unquote authoritarian governments from Venezuela to North Korea, that it's their job. While at the same time, they criticize quote unquote activist journalists. They are doing activism on behalf of the US to pave the way for these kind of, rampant imperialism and militarism. It's disgusting. It's cynical. Just to give you kind of an insight, it may be very obvious if we're looking at something like Fox News, then you have laid bare, like you mentioned, John Bolton just plainly speaking that this is about oil. But then you look at, let's say Reuters, which paints itself as this neutral arbitrator of the truth. Reuters changed their Twitter header and social media banners to Juan Guaido within mere hours of this coup attempt, which really just kind of ripped the mask off of this kind of, idea of impartiality. And it doesn't stop there, of course. You can go to AP, you look at BBC, all of these entities echo the exact same thing. And it's not just the corporate media. It's also non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. There's a human rights industry, and it really is all about who is paying the bills. What foundation money are you getting? What grant money are you getting? And if you're looking at social media, with the non-governmental organizations, a lot of the social media and non-governmental organizations that I'm talking about are flooded and have direct access to opposition figures within Venezuela. So these are the more rich, elite, affluent Venezuelans. You can look at Juan Guaido himself, who's much more well-known in elite US circles in Washington, D.C. than he was in his home country of Venezuela, where 80% of people never heard of him before. And that's the kind of direct access you have to these DC circles, to these corporate media agencies. And that's why you see Venezuelan exiles, right-wing Venezuelans kind of dominating this media sphere and space. And then you look at social media. I just saw Twitter kind of boasting about how they removed over 2,000 pro-Maduro accounts, as we're talking about the rampant, just the rampant domination of Venezuelan exiles and pro-coup Venezuelans. There's a complete erasure of, again, Afro-Venezuelans, indigenous Venezuelans, poor Venezuelans who may or may not have access to social media, but they are also actively becoming invisibilized by these tech giants that are now taking it upon themselves to curate our reality preemptively. There's no law telling these tech giants to do this. They're doing this themselves. And that frankly terrifies me, because it's really shaping and curating this in a way that people don't even know.
Yeah, thank you. And it's interesting because when we talk about that, and then we talk about these media outlets, and we have this idea of like the mainstream or corporate media, and then we have in our minds the media that we can trust, that we can count on, that we can depend on, which is supposed to be the progressive alternative media. But in this situation, the progressive alternative media forces are also beginning to line up behind this very same narrative that Maduro is a dictator who needs to be removed. They're repeating this misinformation. What do the two of you think about that reality, and where are some examples where people can get some good information that is not influenced by these very agents that you were talking about?
Well, I think that's a very important observation. You have to seek out alternative information, because, as you said, even among the alternative press, there's splits. That many of these individuals have inculcated this notion of U.S. exceptionalism. They posit a political position that they say is progressive, where they say something like, we're anti-Maduro, anti-Venezuelan government, and oppose U.S. intervention. Well, that's an abstraction, because the concrete reality is that Venezuela is in the crosshairs of the U.S. state. It is a program of destabilization and state destruction that is on the agenda, and either you are going to oppose that, or you're going to be in alignment with it. So there's no middle road here once you have this kind of imperialist intervention. But again, this reflects the kind of ideological confusion we have in the West, in the US, in Western Europe, when it comes to the realities of various states in the global South who are experimenting with various ways in which they can try to transform themselves, transform their conditions. if it's not done in conjunction with the ideals of Western radicals, then those Western radicals would then align themselves, taking a moralistic position, align themselves with right-wing forces who care nothing about democracy, nothing about human rights, and they will find themselves, in my opinion, not only as collaborators, but also the blood of thousands who may die if there's an intervention in Venezuela. They're going to find that blood also on their hands.
Thank you. Abby, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's really great points, Ajamu, and I think it's really interesting that the corporate media will line up in opposition to Trump, right? But whenever it comes to foreign policy or war or militarism, they push him from the right, and they all just completely accept that this maniac, who they called actually the next Hitler, who they deemed unfit, mentally unstable to serve, to rule. Somehow they trust him to fulfill regime change plans in Venezuela and carry this out. And just one more point about, the New York Times, for example, actually posited this coup, saying to call it a coup is a Russian talking point. So it's just kind of a surreal environment that we're living in, where now reality is called a Russian talking point, and you have, the establishment Beltway press that sets the agenda, the bipartisan agenda for DC. They've been selling wars with they take no responsibility or accountability for the wars that have caused the fall of Libya, the fall of Iraq, and potentially the fall of Venezuela. And you mentioned, where are the reporters that cheered on the Libyan invasion? Where the hell have they been? Now that there's a slave market there, I have not seen them talk about Libya ever since that happened. It's funny that they used to care, but now they're just completely silent on it.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. And I really appreciate the fact that this is reality for us here. This is not just an idea, and these are real people. The lives that are on the line at this moment, the lives that have been lost as a result of these interventionist and imperialist actions and activities by the United States. They are actually human lives, and they matter. And and for a lot of people, it's very distant. It's not real. They can still get their Netflix. They can still go to the mall, and they're not recognizing that they're doing this while people's lives are being destroyed and in their own name. So I just appreciate that, the emotional reality. Yeah.
There are people walking around right now tonight in Venezuela who don't realize that if there is an intervention and a civil war, and there will be if there's an intervention, they don't realize that they may only have a few weeks to live. Now, for me, that's an incredible reality, that decisions being made in Washington and in Montreal and in Paris, that they have those kinds of impacts on real live human beings. So for people to go along with that, to me, it is again a reflection of the kind of normalized immorality that we have in the West, in the U.S. And that's why it's so important for these kinds of conversations, and so important for folks like Abby Martin to present to the public a different view, a different lens. That's why it's so important for a Black Alliance for Peace to present a different view, to let people know that we're not going to go along with the status quo. We're not going to embrace the dominant narrative, that there are in fact people out there that have the nerve and the principles to oppose this kind of madness, no matter how many other people might condemn us. In these critical moments, it's really important for people of conscience, people of principle, to speak out, because the consequence of not speaking out again will be reflected in the real loss of life among real live human beings. So we have no other choice but to oppose this. I mean, it's incredibly frustrating that we don't have more people who understand what's at stake, who don't understand what may happen on Saturday, and who are not standing up in opposition to Trump's invasion.
Thanks. So we have a question from Jed Saunders, who's asking Abby, why is Europe on board with this coup? So can you answer, Jed?
Yeah, Jed, what's really amazing about this is, we're talking about how the corporate media likes to paint a certain narrative, right? Well, they paint all these European countries and U.S. allied Latin American countries as on board as they did during the Iraq War, if you remember. But when you really break it down to who is supporting this and who still recognizes Maduro versus Guaido, it becomes very, very interesting. First of all, I was just looking at a clip from CNN earlier, and they completely erased the African continent entirely. They literally broke the world apart in red and yellow, and Africa was just remained, as if it completely does not matter. When if you look at Africa, the only country that recognizes Guaido is Morocco. The entire continent recognizes Maduro still. And if you look at Europe, you can break it down with the Middle East. The only country that recognizes Guaido is Israel. The only country that recognizes Guaido in the Bahamas. The Bahamas is the only nation in the Caribbean to recognize Guaido. And Europe is actually a little bit more broken down as well. Yeah, you have France, Britain, Germany, of course, the white imperialist colonizer nations, right? But really, if you're looking at the scope of the world and including a lot of parts in Europe, it's the non-colonizer, non-predominantly white nations that still recognize Maduro. And then you have the Vatican as well that's kind of refusing to go along with this, and they're trying to mediate talks. I don't know where that's going to go, but it is really fascinating, and it really shows you how the corporate media operates when they are erasing the voices of non-white, non-colonizer nations as this quote-unquote coalition of the willing.
Thank you, Abby. And you made me think about Haiti, actually, because the Haitian government took a stance with the U.S. around this, and the Haitian people had a strong reaction to that. And so, the people there are calling for the removal of their president. They're asking where their Petrocaribe oil money is. The Black Alliance for Peace issued a statement that links the situation in Venezuela with the situation that's unfolding right now in Haiti. And so, Ajama, could you comment on that?
Yeah, we see very clearly that there is a link. We know that in the opposition to the U.S. imposed president in Haiti, that one of the straws that broke the camel's back in terms of the intensification of opposition in Haiti was when the Haitian government decided to go along with the Lima group, the group of reactionaries in Latin America, to recognize Guaido as the legitimate president. Now, this is after Haiti had been the recipient of significant support from Venezuela for years. And so many people in Haiti saw this as the ultimate betrayal, treachery as it was called. And they helped to intensify the struggles between themselves and this illegitimate president in Haiti. Now, the ties between Haiti and Venezuela go back decades, centuries. We don't have time to get into it completely in terms of those connections, but we know, and I think most people who know something about Haiti and Venezuela know the connection between the liberation movements in South America and the role that Haiti played to support those movements. So there's a long history of struggle and solidarity between those two nations. So it's interesting that that both nations are sort of on fire, if you will. And I think it's a reflection of the will of the people, and really a reflection of the inability of the U.S. to completely control events in what it used to consider to be its backyard.
Yeah, we're going to wrap up in a minute. I wanted to give both of you an opportunity to say something else, and I wanted to start with you, Abby, if you had any final comments. But I wanted to ask you, in considering your final comments, to also just reiterate, if you could, and talk a little bit about the state of Venezuela, as it, you know, and the people, particularly the Black and Indigenous communities in Venezuela, and how this tyrannical government that we are supposedly trying to save them from has impacted the lives of these communities that we know tend to be the most dispossessed and are the most dispossessed in these colonized or these formerly colonized nations, and just put that into perspective.
Of course, 20% of Venezuela is Afro-Venezuelan. Hugo Chavez was the first president that was African, that was indigenous in part, and he embraced that fully. And a lot of the racism and bigotry against the Bolivarian movement has been racist and has been white supremacist in its nature, as well as, of course, the class struggle that we're talking about, which goes hand in hand. You know, I think people need to ask yourselves, why have we never heard from Afro-Venezuelans? Why are Afro-Venezuelans not why are their voices not out there front and center, being such a huge part of this population? Yeah, and especially since we're using the poorest and most vulnerable aspects of Venezuela as the pretense for this quote-unquote humanitarian military intervention. Before Hugo Chavez got into power, these were millions of people who were rendered invisible. They were given no services. They didn't even have citizenship in a lot of senses. They didn't have rights in the country. After Hugo Chavez's election, and with the widespread implementation of social programs that, you know, liberals will bemoan Chavez and say, oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. Look, again, he used the oil revenue to take care of the poor. That was his primary function, and that's exactly what he did. Now, there's several things that the Chavez administration did. Like you mentioned, Petrocaribe. This is a program that sold oil significantly less to all Caribbean nations. There's only 3 Caribbean nations that are not part of this program. And that had a huge impact on helping ramp up their social lives in those countries. Also, you know, you had Hugo Chavez providing aid to Haiti after the earthquake. He provided aid actually after Hurricane Katrina, which the George W. Bush administration refused to accept, kind of ironically, given the situation today. You had whole Black Afro-Indigenous communities that were trapped kind of in these shanty towns, the barrios that are up on these large mountainous regions in Caracas and outside of that area, that Chavez did widespread public transportation programs for, access to healthcare, access to education and schools for free, essentially. And so now those communities have direct access to city centers, towns, and these services that are so important. They funded refugee camps that they still operate within Haiti. The FARC program, the FARC peace deal that Maduro was helping to be a big part of to go through in Colombia, that primarily impacted Afro-Colombians. So there's so much even beyond the borders of Venezuela because, of course, socialism is an internationalist, you know, having an internationalist approach to this, a lot of integration with the Afro-Indigenous communities all over Latin America and the Caribbean through the works of Cuba and Venezuela. And that's really where the stakes are right now. The stakes are very high, as Ajamu was mentioning. I mean, this could turn into not only a civil war, but a full-blown kind of Panamanian-style Just Cause 2.0, where Trump is threatening daily in a menacing way that a U.S. military option is not off the table. Millions of lives potentially are at stake, and millions of people who will lose access to these crucial programs and will be rendered invisible once again with this U.S. puppet if he does impose himself in this country.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Abby. And Ajamu, when in your comments, could you also address Jed Saunders' question here, who is considered the Black political establishment? We referenced them when we were talking earlier. He wants a little bit of clarity about that, and any other final comments that you may have. And then I'd like for people to be able to know where they can find the two of you, your social media.
Thank you. Jed, we refer to the Black political establishment. We many of us who work, who write for the Black Agenda Report, we also refer to them as the Black misleadership class. This is the element of the Black political establishment that is in complete alignment with the Democrat Party, its neoliberal and imperialist agenda. These are elements that have basically put their political future with the establishment as opposed to the interests of the Black working class and poor people in the United States. So they have an interest in the Black political community being unaware of and not involved in opposition to U.S. imperialism. And that's why we have made a conscious effort to educate our community so that they can, in fact, begin to impose some accountability on these Black officials. We are in conversation with members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and we're telling the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, you have to take a stance. We need to know, where do you stand on this intervention in Venezuela? Where do you stand with the U.S. Africa Command that is responsible for the expansion of militarism on the African continent? Why did you oppose the Department of Defense 1033 program, that program responsible for militarizing police forces across the U.S., militarizing them with high-grade military equipment that then used against the Black working class? We have to have that kind of accountability if we're going to be able to really begin to shift power away from those forces back to the people. In the case of this intervention, we want the Black misleadership class to take a stance. We want them to say either they are with Trump or they are opposed. At this point, it's quite clear they are, in fact, with Trump. Now, it's very important for people to speak out on this. Again, this is a critical moment that we're facing. We don't know what's going to happen on Saturday. We have to, in the next day, let our public officials know that there are significant forces out here in the public that are opposed to whatever adventure they may have planned for February 23rd. We're asking people to come out on February 23rd. It's a day of International Day of Action on Venezuela. You can go to the Black Alliance for Peace to get information on February 23rd. You can go to the website of the United National Anti-War Coalition to get a list of where demonstrations are being organized across the country. We say, come out, demonstrate that there's opposition to this imperialist agenda in the U.S. So we have a responsibility, we have a task over the next few days to oppose this intervention and to begin to reverse this process of gangsterism by the U.S. state. People have to understand that this intervention is illegal in every sense of the word. It is illegal under U.S. law. It is illegal under international law. There is no legal basis and justification for this kind of intervention. So what we see, in fact, is an example of a rogue statism. The U.S. has become a rogue state. The question that the public has to answer, are you going to support this, or are you going to oppose this kind of gangsterism?
And Ashamu, you were mentioning February 23rd. Can you just speak about, February 23rd is the Day of Solidarity,
Yes.
but there's another side to activities that are happening on February 23rd. Can you just make sure that that's clear for the audience?
The other side of Day of Activities, I'm not sure what you mean. Yeah.
You were saying that we have to determine on February 23rd that on the 23rd on Saturday, right? So
basically, the 23rd of February is the day that the illegitimate puppet government of Juan Guaido says that they're going to bring in so-called humanitarian assistance into Venezuela. Now, what that means or how that might happen, we don't know. But it appears that some type of attempt to penetrate the the sovereignty of Venezuela may occur. And if that happens, the Venezuelan forces are prepared to defend the integrity of their territory. So February 23rd is a very, very important date, and is a pivotal. And hopefully, if we're able to withstand this attempt on the 23rd, I think we're going to see a rapid dissipation of the coup, and that's what it is, the coup attempt in Venezuela.
Thank you. Abby, can you let people know where they can find you on social media, how they can identify you?
Yeah, we're actually putting out an episode within the hour debunking the ocean of lies in Venezuela with that UN human rights expert that I was talking about, Alfred de Zayas. So please check that out on the Empire Files. Like Ajamu said, we need to get out in the streets. We need to be mobilizing. We need to be opposing this brazen imperialist coup that could result in a full-fledged war and cost the lives of tens of thousands of people. The blood will be on the US government's hands, of course. And so not only is this action coming up this weekend, but there's also March 16th in Washington, D.C. There's an enormous action held there, solidarity actions happening in LA, San Francisco around that time. Buses are coming into DC from all over the country. So please, we need to stand together. We need to mobilize. We need to get involved. Thank you so much. It's been an honor. Huge fan of you, Ajamu, and thank you so much, Yane. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for being here. And Ajamu, can you let people know where they can find you, or they can follow you as well?
Well, but definitely please go to blackallianceforpeace.com, where the real organizer work is taking place. If you want to follow me individually, is ajamubaraka.com. And also, I'm doing the Twitter stuff too, so you can follow me there.
We do have, the Black Alliance for Peace does also have a campaign right now that is also confronting another of the imperialist activities of the Axis of Domination, the AFRICOM program, and are calling for the U.S. to get out of Africa and shut down AFRICOM. You can go on to tinyurl.com, as shown here, shut down AFRICOM, AFRICOM, to sign the petition and learn more about that. And please visit www.blackallianceforpeace in order to learn more about our campaigns, in order to look into joining the organization as a member or supporter, to donate, please. And my name again is Yane Indigo. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Black Alliance for Peace. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Ajamu. I'm sorry that Glenn was not able to make it. It was some technical difficulties in that arena, but I think this was really informative, and I really encourage people to continue to dig and to remember that you cannot go on what you're being told by mainstream media, because those are resources that are owned and directed by the elite class that oppresses all of the rest of us.
Thank you so much, Yane. Thank you so much, Abby. It's been a pleasure and honor.
Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Peace.